Nice to see all of you here. And my goal tonight is to really talk primarily about two species of whales, humpback and gray whales, that have become increasingly common in our local waters. And I started studying these species quite a while ago, but it's been interesting. I've been based here in Olympia, primarily studying humpback whales down off California, and then sometimes off the Washington coast. But in recent over the last 5 to 10 years, we've had more and more whales coming into the Sound. So the focus of my talk is about especially the whales in our waters here. There's a lot of attention, like I gave a talk a month ago, and I called it the other whales of Puget Sound or the Salish Sea, because so much interest, focus, and attention is currently going to the southern resident killer whales and the plight that they face. And I have sort of taken my role now is to always keep reminding people too that we have these other whale species that are actually becoming more common in our waters. They face a number of threats that I wanted to talk about, but I also wanted to talk about how exciting it is that there's some really positive things that have happened with these two species of whales, especially with some of the challenges the southern resident killer whales face and the dire situation they're in. It can be easy to get discouraged, and I wanted to also point out there are some nice success stories of what's happened with some other whale species, though with those success stories have come additional interactions with humans that we can certainly improve and help allow them to survive and thrive in our waters now that they've returned into them. So I'll be talking throughout about these large whale species. I'll make a mention of killer whales at the end, and talking about some of the current threats they face. And I know the theme of these talks is to talk about kind of climate. I'm going to be more focused on some of the kind of immediate threats these whales face, but that climate change is a huge threat these whales face down the road. In a lot of cases, we are currently at a place where we're speculating on exactly how it will impact certain species and at what points. But clearly rapid changes to our climate and to ocean conditions will often outstrip the abilities of these whales that are kind of supremely adapted to the habitat we're currently in. Okay, so just a little bit of background on Cascadia. Cascadia Research is based here in Olympia. It's a nonprofit organization. A number of us, including myself, started in 1979. A number of us had gone to Evergreen and graduated from there, had started studying marine mammals in the 1970s. And then we formed Cascadia Research, which is a tax-exempt nonprofit organization. We're based about 6 blocks that way, the wrong way down 4th Avenue above Childhood's End. We have about 20 researchers that are based there, so we've grown. We study marine mammals primarily in 2 regions. The program I head up is on West Coast marine mammals, with doing research from down off Central America up to off Alaska, but centered off California, Oregon, and Washington. And then we have another research program centered in Hawaii that's based here in Olympia, headed by Dr. Robin Baird, and studies various Odonocete species in Hawaii. But this poster kind of shows some of the range of activities we're engaged in on the West Coast, which we monitor the trends in these populations. We do tagging research. A lot of our studies involve how are these populations faring? Are they in trouble? Are they increasing or decreasing? What threats do they face? And we also do things like monitor the strandings of marine mammals. So we have a whole stranding program that responds to when animals wash up on the beach. We do quite a bit of research on the water. We primarily work from these small boats. We have 4 of these rigid hull inflatables that we use up and down the West Coast, some of them based in California, some of them up here that we'll take out from shore. Most of these boats are about 20 feet long, but we'll take them out 50, 100. I think the record we set last year was 150 miles offshore working in these boats. So we have a fair amount of range. Sometimes we'll work off larger ships and launch, like you see in that lower right photo. But these are really seaworthy boats. We carry a lot of safety equipment. They're lightweight so that we can easily tow them. They're highly maneuverable so that we can maneuver close to whales for some of the types of research we do. And some of the research I'm going to talk about is there's some research we started doing in the 1970s and 80s that we continue today. And then there's also been these exciting new areas of research that have been opened up by some of the new technologies that are available, especially as they relate to things like tags that we can deploy on whales with miniaturized electronics and cameras. And I'll show you I'll maybe disproportionately show you some of that just because it's really fun stuff. It's fun stuff for me to do, and it's also exciting for me because in some cases I studied these whales for 20, 30 years, not really knowing what they did underwater, and suddenly these new tags give us a way to, and give me a way to really understand what's going on under the water. But one of the longer term techniques we've used has been photo identification of individual whales. And it's actually kind of odd how this has become probably one of the strongest things Cascadia does. For the US West Coast, we're the primary catalogers of humpback whales, blue whales, sperm whales, gray whales, all large whale species that we can track individuals with their natural markings. And Robin Baird's Hawaii program tracks more than a dozen different odontocetes, again, recognizing individual animals. So it's become an area of specialty for us. Sometimes it's using things like the flukes, or sometimes it's markings on the sides of whales. With species like killer whales, it's extensively used, again, not by us, mostly studied by other researchers, where every individual in the population can be tracked. With most of the species we study that are less accessible and more offshore, we're more sampling some of the individuals. And you know, the three probably largest catalogs we have for whales we track are humpback, blue, and gray whales. And often we use these photo IDs really to try to answer very basic questions. How many whales there are their populations increasing or decreasing? What are their movements and migration patterns? And sometimes it may seem like, from the level of attention and whale watching that occurs, that we must have answered some of these really basic questions, but we really haven't. This remains, in many cases, key questions we're trying to answer in terms of how these species are doing, and I'll show you some of the type of data that we get. Now, our catalogs to track these individuals by their natural markings have gotten pretty large for those three species I just mentioned. For example, with humpback whales in our catalog currently, just for the West Coast, we have over 4,000 different individuals identified, and we have over 37,000 records of them. That means an instance where we identified an individual and can track it. So on average, each individual we've seen about 8 or 9 times. But really, there's a bunch of individuals we've seen only once, and many that we've seen, 30, 40, 50 times. And that's an example. For example, that fluke that you see on the screen there is actually of a humpback whale that was very famous when we began our research. It was a humpback whale called Humphrey, that we named Humphrey, that swam up the Sacramento River in 1985 initially, right when we were starting our research on humpback whales, and then again came back in 1990. And between those time periods, I think I ran into Humphrey about 12 times in different places. But he ended up being kind of a whale that got a lot of media attention at that time just because of this trek he did multiple times.
Made it in the New York Times, as I remember.
Yes. But many of the other whales are not don't have the same notoriety, if you will, as Humphrey did. But he had a very distinctive fluke that's a good example of how we identify these individuals. With gray whales, the population size is estimated at well over 20,000 animals. And when I talk about gray whales in a little more detail, we actually focus on the whales that feed and use our waters rather than those that migrate up to Alaska. So it's a subset of the population. Last year was a very exciting year for us because this photo ID research has been going on for, we started doing this on a dedicated fashion in the mid-1980s. We had our biggest effort last year because we worked with NOAA that had a ship survey covering the entire US West Coast. So that's a NOAA ship that you see there in the middle, and then you can see almost equal size boat right below it. maybe they're not exactly to scale, but, and the transect lines they did, you'll see, are on that map. All of those lines were survey lines that NOAA did in the ship survey. And the exciting part for us was it was a byproduct of the fact on the ship survey, they were going to be more restricted in their operations. And so they had initially approached us about, well, is there any way you can supplement our observations with small boat surveys as we're doing them? And this sounded like the perfect dream to us. So we actually ended up tracking that survey that went down the coast doing all of those lines, and we were launching out of individual ports and following up these great sighting reports that they got from doing this very dedicated survey with trained observers and these giant binoculars called big eyes that let you survey broad expanses of the water. And so they were feeding us sighting information, and we were launching and going out to identify whales, and it gave us the best coverage we've ever had of the West Coast. And so I know this is going to be on a scale that's hard to see, but these three maps show the whole U.S. West Coast from, Mexico up to BC. On the left, all those little squiggly lines are actually the tracks of our small boat. And you'll see they're kind of clustered. They look like little spread out diamonds as we launch from various ports to go out. But we pretty much covered the whole West Coast with our small boat tracks just from last year. And then the middle panel shows where we sighted humpback whales in those surveys. I didn't show the ship survey sightings, which were even, more extensive than what we did from our small boat. And then in the right panel, you actually have where we collected these small skin samples from the whales. And it's just, this was exciting to me just because we'd never gotten that kind of coverage to look at the distribution of humpback whales and get these identification photographs and samples from them from the entire West Coast area. Now, when you get thousands of photographs like we have, and you have a catalog that's 3,000 or 4,000, you wonder, well, how do you do that matching? And up until just a few years ago, we did it all by hand. And there's some even people in the room here that have assisted with us. We would often have up to a half dozen interns working with us that would help in this hand matching, going through, searching our catalog of thousands of whales to match each of these individuals up. And one of the exciting new developments, even though over the entire 30 plus years we've been doing this, there have been different endeavors to try to automate this process. None of them had been quite successful enough to replace the skill of the human eye. So even though some of those, helped to find some matches, they all fell pretty far short of what a human can do. But for the first time, we've worked with a team of computer vision programmers that using two different programs, one that looks at the pattern of the light and dark pigment on the back of the whales, and also another program that looks at the trailing edge, have developed automated techniques that actually rival our human matchers. By rival, I mean it was successful in its top 4 choices in finding the correct match over 90% of the time, which 90% had been our threshold. Human matchers had about that success level. And finally, these programs could do it. The only difference was that our human matchers, it would usually take a team of 4 of them about a year to match. And usually once we got all the data organized and all the photographs organized and submitted it to one of the computer programmers, they would send us the results the next day. So it was a little bit faster. Now, of course, there was still the very time-consuming measure of verifying each of those, which we would do and go through and dealing with the data, but it dramatically helped us in dealing with this kind of massive amount of data. Just a few things I won't want to belabor. Humpback whale distribution, along the West Coast, there's a little bit of a color coding here. It's very much these red areas and these dots show areas of whale concentration based on an analysis we did a few years ago with colleagues at Southwest Fisheries Science Center. And it allowed us to identify what we call these biologically important feeding areas for humpback whales along the U.S. West Coast. And for humpback whales, that included areas like the Santa Barbara Channel, up here and around Monterey Bay and the Gulf of the Farallones off San Francisco. But one of the areas we identified was up here off northern Washington. And You'll notice the density of dots and the color isn't as red there, so we don't quite have as many humpback whales as occur in some of those areas in California. But part of the reason we identified this region as being an important area is because the whales that are off Washington are actually what we call a different feeding aggregation. We see very little interchange between the humpback whales that feed off Washington and those that fed off California and Oregon. And even when we collected these skin samples and looked at some of the genetic patterns, we even found some differences that were consistent between those groups that showed they'd been relatively isolated for an extended period of time. And it's a little more complicated than I want to get into because those whales still interbreed on breeding grounds, but they show loyalty in what areas they return to. And because they return to those areas with their calves then end up adopting those areas. And what it creates is these maternal lineages of animals. And one way we test that is a portion of the DNA called the mitochondrial DNA is only transferred from the mother to her offspring. And that's where we see these really dramatic differences in the mitochondrial DNA patterns between the humpbacks that feed off California and Washington. So even though they might interbreed with males from a different feeding ground, the mothers and all of their offspring represent one lineage. And that has important management implications. The bottom line, what it means is if you had a threat to whales off Washington, and I'm going to talk about some of those entanglement ship strikes that were eliminating whales, they would not quickly be repopulated from other regions. And that's why you have to use that information as a way to recognize we need to manage these populations and these threats on a more local level. Okay, the danger I always run into when I give these talks is I go too long. So if you find me dallying too long, I'm going to try to keep moving here because we're 25 minutes in and I'm about a tenth of the way through. So I'm going to pick it up a little bit. Yeah. Oh, you will. And just to show you, whales from particular areas do migrate to multiple of these breeding grounds. Humpback whales, like many other baleen whales, travel in the winter to specific breeding grounds. So up here, where we have the humpback whales off the Pacific Northwest, they roughly split between going to Hawaii to breed and some coming down here to Mexico, and then a small number coming all the way down to Central America. And that's become significant, especially because now with the recognition that some of these units represent distinct units, there actually is a different endangered status for whales from these different breeding populations. And for example, Central America is still considered endangered under the Endangered Species Act. Mexico is treated as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, and the whales that breed in Hawaii are not listed under the ESA, under a new set of proposals that came out a few years ago and that were adopted by NOAA. And part of that came from some of the research we've been engaged in that showed humpback whales were recovering in some areas but still remained in very low numbers in others. Okay, I don't want to get too much into track. Now, humpback whales have been recovering in many of these areas, and this is part of the kind of exciting good news part of humpback whales. They were hunted. We like to think of whaling for humpback whales as something that occurred a long, long time ago and maybe something that other countries do. But the United States had whaling stations operating, land-based whaling stations sending boats out that hunted humpback whales through 1966. So that's while I was still alive. It's still while some of the humpback whales that are out there is still alive. So they were hunted within their lifetime. And they extremely depleted those populations. And that's what drove many of the large whale populations to near extinction. And this is the trend in humpback whale abundance along the U.S. West Coast from some of our early research. This is going back to about 1990 in this case. And you'll see these three different lines are actually three different mark recapture models. And I'm not going to get into their difference, but they all showed the same trend. And they all show that humpback whales were recovering through the 1990s and the 2000s at a rate of about 7 to 8% per year, which was pretty healthy. And that represented them coming back from that whaling. And then you'll see a trend towards it leveling off more recently. And we attributed that to it looked like humpback whales maybe were finally recovering to the level they were at prior to whaling. Now, this graph cuts off at 2015, and some of the data we've gotten in the last year or two, and once we process 2018, may be calling this graph into question. We may actually have seen another uptick. So up until recently, I would have said it looks like it had leveled off, but it looks like it may have taken another uptick. But basically, a pretty good news story of humpback whales recovering. And what that meant for me is just in the time that I had studied humpback whales, I had seen their population go along the West Coast from under 500 to over 2,000. So more than a fourfold increase just in the time I've been studying them. Yes?
How old are they before they breed?
Yes, humpback whales, like other large whales, breed fairly slowly. They generally breed every 2 to 3 years. Which is why that growth rate of 7% is pretty fast. And usually they don't start giving birth to young until somewhere in the 5 to 10-year-old neighborhood. And along with this increase, we also saw the return and increased occurrence of humpback whales in a number of areas we hadn't seen them before. And that's what's shown by these arrows on this map. And the one I'm going to focus in on, but I'll start at the south, and then finish up with the Salish Sea. But, we were seeing the expansion of humpback whales into habitats further south than we normally had. We had humpback whales returning in the last 3 or 4 years coming into San Francisco Bay. 2 years ago, we actually started to deploy some of these suction cup attached tags, actually deployed 4 tags on humpback whales under the Golden Gate Bridge, which was a unique experience for me. And it was during the day they were having the San Francisco Marathon over the bridge. And I could say there were thousands of people on the bridge and none of them saw us because there was this fog layer that completely obscured. But it was interesting. They were coming into the bay, coming into the Columbia River, but most importantly, and what I'll show you a little bit more about, coming into the Salish Sea. Now, I showed you that earlier map where I showed this kind of biologically important area off the Washington coast. But that's kind of changed a little bit in recent years with those animals coming more and more into the Salish Sea. And Salish Sea refers to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the Strait of Georgia, and Puget Sound. Those bodies of water between British Columbia and Washington and our inside waters are being increasingly called the Salish Sea as a whole. And this shows you just the sighting reports of humpback whales that we would receive at Cascadia Research and at Orca Network over the years inside the Salish Sea. And there used to be just a handful of sighting reports we would get through the 1990s. And then starting in the late 2000s, it started to increase dramatically. And that really reflected the increased occurrence of these animals coming further and further into the Puget Sound and into the straits, whereas we would only get occasional animals wandering in before. And the distribution of those sightings, I know these are going to be hard to see, but they're little tiny squares throughout Puget Sound here, throughout the strait. These are all sighting locations of humpback whales in the last 6-7 years. And so they're widely distributed, but they're also really biased. Like these sightings, in Puget Sound are probably not too bad, but you'll probably see there's a cluster of sightings around Seattle, and that might more reflect not that humpback whales like Seattle, but there are more people to report sightings there. Or you see this big cluster around Victoria, and that may have something to do with the fact that Victoria is the largest location from which a lot of whale watch vessels depart. So there's some bias in this, but it does show that widespread distribution of animals. And I mentioned that whaling went on in areas like out of San Francisco Bay through 1966, but there were also whaling stations that operated not as recently as that, but in our waters. This is a picture of the whaling station at Bay City, Washington. And you may not know where Bay City is, but if you're driving to Westport, just before you make that right turn to go to Westport, you go over a bridge, and there's a road called Whalebone Way, which might give you a hint of what it is. And that's where Bay City was. When you go over that bridge, if you look to your left, there are a bunch of pilings, and they're the pilings to this whaling station right here that operated in the early 1900s and hunted whales in our Washington waters and had a major effect. probably more relevant to the Salish Sea and Puget Sound was a whaling station that operated out of southern Vancouver Island near Nanaimo. And it was actually a whaling station in inside waters, and the whalers realized, well, we can't hunt whales in the winter offshore. A lot of them are migrated south and it's too rough out there, but there seem to be these whales that are sticking around through the winter and in times of year that's harder for us to hunt. And they killed hundreds of whales inside the Salish Sea, and I think that's when they largely eliminated that more local group of whales that used our inside waters, that only now in the last 10 years have started to return. And I think humpback whales have that loyalty to areas, so when I say return, what I'm really talking about is as the population increased, they slowly expanded outward to occupy some of these areas that had been abandoned when whales were killed out of them. Okay, now I'm going to shift gears. So the pattern of this talk, I'm like a quarter of the way through now, so I've got to go even faster. That was a little bit about humpback whales. I'm going to talk a little bit about gray whales. Then we're going to talk a little bit about tagging and the insights it gives us. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about threats. So I've got, just so you know what's coming and why I need to keep moving. The gray whales that we study, gray whales are known for this long migration they make, one of the longest migrations of any mammal, from breeding areas down here off Baja all the way up the coast to their primary feeding grounds up here in the Arctic. Now, while that's what over 20,000 gray whales do, our area here is also occupied by a smaller group of what we've discovered. And I'll treat this, it's been the focus of my research has been identifying that there's about 200 gray whales that now has been given the name Pacific Coast Feeding Group of gray whales, that instead of migrating to Alaska, they come and they feed from California up to British Columbia and do that from spring to fall, never making that northern migration. And that was kind of different than what we expected, but it's also now had some important management considerations given the proposed resumption of whale hunting by the Makah tribe, which they initially proposed in the 1990s. That's been on hold for a while. They did hunt and kill one whale, but is likely to be resumed within the next year or two. There were some legal challenges that required an environmental impact statement and other procedures to occur that are now almost completed. And then I'm going to talk just briefly about a group of whales that actually comes deep into the Salish Sea called the sounders. And this is a group of whales that seems to have adopted this area just starting in about 1990. And so they're a part of this other species that's now become more common inside the Salish Sea and inside Puget Sound. And they have sort of a unique story I'll share with you as well. I think this is actually a photo from one of the last of the Makah traditional hunts in the early 1900s. And this is pictures taken from the air of that hunt when it resumed in 1999. And this is the one whale they were able to take in that hunt before that hunt was suspended again. We've been tracking this Pacific Coast feeding group of whales. It did look like it went through an increase in the late 1990s, but has been sort of stable right around 200 whales that is part of that Pacific Coast feeding group. And one of the nice things that's happened is that the Makah hunt, when it resumed, when it was first occurring in the 1990s, whether you were for or against the hunt, one of the important things for me was that the hunt, if it was conducted, recognize the existence of this small population of whales that use those waters, that they weren't all treated the same, because that group of whales, it was clear to us from our photo ID studies, was the same group of whales returning every year. And again, you would have a bigger impact on a group of 200 whales than on a group of 20,000 whales are the hunt. And at least now in how the hunt would be resumed, it would recognize this Pacific Coast feeding group as a unique group of whales and add protections for that group. Now, gray whales, like humpback whales, are baleen whales. They feed by filtering their prey. And they use these baleen plates that hang from the roof of their mouth that you see on the left side here. And then this is a little bit of a gory, but what we'd call maybe the krill's eye view of baleen from the inside instead of the outside. And the key working part of the baleen is actually these plates on the inside edge. These baleen plates break down into these frill-like hairs and form this dense sieve-like mat that you can see would be an incredibly effective filter for anything this whale brings into its mouth, and the filtering occurs as it pushes the water and mixture back out. And depending on what whale species, there are 3 different strategies that different groups of whales use, from right whales and bowhead whales that are continuous ram feeders. They basically swim through the water with the mouth partway open and let water flow in and filter as it comes out, to humpback whales that are what are called lunge feeders. They engulf large amounts of prey. And then gray whales represent the 3rd category. They actually suction feed off the bottom and suck in sediment and other organisms. And I'll show you some unique views of that. Now, what's kind of wild about the gray whales that are in Puget Sound and use the Salish Sea up around Everett is you can actually see the visible evidence of their feeding in a way that is hard to imagine. They'll come into shallow waters and actually feed in the intertidal zone. So part of the water that's, covered by water at high tide, but is high and dry at low tide. So they've got to get into really shallow water. We got big tides here in Puget Sound, but still they're feeding in typically 6 to 10 feet of water. And it's barely enough. When they feed in those areas, there's usually parts of their flippers and pec fins that are out of the water as they maneuver into these areas. And the reason they're doing that is these areas have these dense ghost shrimp beds that, as I'll show you, is an incredibly rich food source. Now, from the air, and this is an aerial photograph of the beach at low tide, and each of these little dimples that you see here is actually a depression in the mud made by a feeding gray whale at high tide that now has pooled water at low tide. So each of these little dimples is about 6 feet long and about 3 feet wide. And that's an area the whale actually suctioned and excavated the ghost shrimp out of that area. Now, these whales that have learned this strategy in the Salish Sea, it turns out it's some of the same animals have learned to do this. This is over 150 miles off their migratory pathway. And some of the individuals are very distinctly marked, like this is an individual we gave the very unique name of Patch to. You might be able to guess why we gave it that name, but we tried to come up with more creative names later, but Patch and Spot were the kind of names that came to mind at the beginning. And if I show you, this looks complicated at first blush, but let me just explain what it is. Each row here is a different individual. Like Patch is whale 49, and then you see years from 1990 up through 2017 in this case. And if there's a number and it's shaded white, that means we saw that whale that year. And so the main thing I want you to get from this is that there's about a dozen of these whales that we see year after year, the same whales coming back. So even though they're going on this long migration, they come to this exact spot to feed and learn what I would call this high-risk feeding behavior that they've been able to adopt. If any of you are boaters and spend time in areas of big high tides, you know what it's like to go into shallow waters where there's a big tide and how easily you can get stranded on there. So these whales are taking a major gamble in doing that. You'll also notice there are a bunch of whales that first appear here on the left edge, the top whales, in 1990 and 91. And then there's another half dozen whales that show up in 1999 and 2000. And it looks like the whales that discovered this kind of really rich prey area and this high-risk feeding strategy came in 2 waves. One in 1990 and 91, and one in 1999 and 2000. And I hate to say it, but it wasn't until about a year ago that I finally put that together with some other data to realize there was some significance to those 2 periods. And if you plot on this top chart, it's how many gray whales died and washed up in Washington state. And that tends to be a reflection of how healthy the gray whale population is. When they're migrating past, if they didn't have a very good feeding year, we get more whales dying. And you'll notice a big peak here in 2 years right here, and the next highest peak is 2 years right here. And this is 1999 and 2000, and this is 1990 and 91. So the two waves of whales that discovered our waters were during years that gray whales were struggling and having a hard time finding enough to eat. Most of those whales that washed up dead were starving to death. So it was kind of an increasing whale population meeting some poor prey years. And so I think it was that desperation that led to whales exploring and finding some of these new high-risk areas to feed that then they've returned to year after year. Now, you too can go and look at gray whale feeding pits if you want to. All you have to do is go on Google Earth, and you can go to Everett. This is the town of Everett here, and this is the Snohomish River Delta. And there's a little clock icon that's an option you can pick, and it lets you cycle backwards in time to look at the aerial images from other dates. And if you find some of the images from springtime during low tide periods, you can actually zoom in, and this is a zoomed in image out of Google Earth. And all of these little dots that you see here are the feeding pits of gray whales. And here we've actually added little white dots to every place we found a feeding pit in multiple images. And someone named Nathan Harrison, an intern with us who then worked with us, went through and identified close to 20,000 feeding pits that are visible on Google Earth over these series of images. We're trying to write a paper, just, you wouldn't think you could use Google Earth to find whale feeding areas, but it actually worked really well in this case. Now, I mentioned tagging, and I want to show you just a few insight. We started in the 1990s deploying initially these really clunky, large tags. This is a National Geographic critter cam, which we for the first time deployed on blue whales and humpback whales in the 1990s. Now we have much smaller tags. We generally approach whales in our small boats. We have these kind of bow pulpits put in the front of our boats, and you kind of reach out with a pole and actually press the tag on. And it's a way we can kind of deploy these tags. The data that we can get from them has become increasingly sophisticated over time. The irony is, in the very early tags we deployed, we had video. The critter cam was a high-8 video camera inside a titanium housing. And then we focused much more on data type tags. And in the last 3-4 years, we've actually returned now with the miniaturization of videos with GoPros and other small things. We've now started to add video back into our tags. And so we've kind of come back to video, if you will. And here you just see the contrast. Here's a critter cam. This is a suction cup that's about 6-inch diameter. This whole thing weighed probably 5 to 10 pounds. And here's the tags we deployed on gray whales in the last couple of years. And this is mostly flotation, so it will float. This one actually has 2 video cameras right here and here facing forward and to the right and left to give us almost a 180-degree view of the whale. Other video cameras we had would also face forward and back, and I'll show you some examples of those. And these are really small suction cups, just about that big around, that we can press on with these smaller tags. And probably the species we've tagged the most that unfortunately I'm not going to show you much about are blue whales. And it is probably one of the more thrilling parts of my job is trying to approach these whales closely. We've gotten pretty good at doing it in these small boats. This is me and 2 colleagues. Let's see if I can get back to that. Approaching a blue whale, the largest animal that's ever lived, but this whale is probably not one of those largest. It's probably an 80-foot long blue whale, and we're approaching it in our 25-foot boat in this case. And you can see we've got the tag on the end of the pole and about to make an approach. This was a swordfish spotter plane, because we were about 30 miles offshore, happened to be flying over and took these images and sent them to me. So usually we don't get a lot. Okay, Now let's see if I can freeze this image for a second here. Okay, I've frozen it. So now I'm just going to show you some of the video from the gray whales in the Salish Sea from northern Puget Sound. And in this case here, we have a right-facing camera, and this is the left-facing camera. But because we put the camera on not perfectly pointed straight ahead, this camera is actually looking straight forward along the body of the whale, and this camera is actually looking off to the left of the whale. And then I'm not going to belabor, but these are part of the 12 different sensors that the tag is recording, sometimes at hundreds of times a second for things like accelerometry. So with the miniaturization of data storage now, we can store this huge amount of data on these tags. Now, there are other types of tags that mostly other researchers deploy that are tags that you deploy and you don't try to recover, and the information is transmitted to satellite, and you can get longer periods of data. But those tags are incredibly limited in how much data they can gather because the whale's only briefly at the surface. It has to have a satellite in the right position and this brief instant to transmit information. So typically, you're transmitting just a few data points a day in those types of settings, but you can get it for a longer period. We use what are called archival tags, typically attacked with suction cups, and we get very intense data for short periods of time with a less invasive tag, but we have to recover the tag because all the data is stored on it. And so I'll show you, for example, one of the first discoveries. This was the first deployment we did on a gray whale, and it was one of the female. Most of the whales up in the Salish Sea are males. But this, we believe, might be the founding female. We gave her the name Earhart, after Amelia Earhart, because we think she was sort of the pioneer that discovered this feeding on these intertidal beds inside the Salish Sea. And you'll see partly why other whales may have discovered it. But we deployed this tag, and within the first very short amount of time, in fact, it's at about 7 minutes, you'll see what happens. Here's another whale that comes along and rubs up against her. And that tag just got turned around 180 degrees. So we had perfectly positioned this tag so it'd be facing forward and capture her feeding. And now it's facing perfectly backwards. And this did that right off the bat. But that turned out to be kind of interesting because now we have a tag facing straight back, and this one's now kind of facing off to the left of the whale. And you'll see as this runs, we'll see first one, and then two, and then finally three gray whales are following this female into the feeding shallows to feed. So she's one of the few females, and all three of these whales that are following her are males. And now you can sort of see them come into view. This is the one whale that turned the tag around here, and then you'll see two other whales show up over here on the image. And they'll follow her in, and then they'll all start to feed somewhat separate from each other. And interestingly, now you see a second whale coming into view there, and finally a third whale. Now all three whales are just following along. And this was one of the discoveries that we hadn't quite appreciated. You see whales together and you don't think much about it, or I didn't think much about it, and I hadn't quite appreciated the degree to which they were making contact with each other, socializing in these ways, not just when they were traveling, but also in resting mode. Now maybe I'm going to freeze this, but this is another tag, just to say it didn't always work against us. You'll see how this tag is sort of shaking here. This is a tag that's hanging on by one suction cup. It's about to fall off, and it's facing backwards. And here comes another gray whale, and you actually see here's two gray whales, and they're going to come up and rub up against this whale. And you'll actually see little bits of skin come off as they rub against the whale. On this first pass, they don't make contact with the tag. They're actually just rubbing up against the whale. But then here on a second pass, the whale's going to come and actually make contact with the tag right about there. And right now, the whale has turned the tag around facing perfectly forward. You'll see that image now is This is the right side of the head of the whale, and this is the left side of the head of the whale. And when you surface it, you'll be able to see the blowhole. So, and you'll also see the tag is no longer shaking. At the time we deployed this, this became one of our longest deployments. This tag stayed on 64 hours because the whales kept pressing the tag back on. And we hadn't had a tag last that long. So that was kind of exciting. Okay. Let's see, we want to go on to a new slide. And now the main thing we were after was understanding how these whales were feeding, how often they were feeding. We could see these pits they created, but we didn't know how that interacted, like how long did it take a whale to create a pit? Was it feeding on other things other than at these high tide periods, this small window it could access the bed? So partly what we used these tags then to do is look at how much they fed. And I'm just going to show you one thing, like right here. This in red is the depth sensor of, no, excuse me, this is the roll sensor on the gyroscope of the tag. And this is 0 degrees down at the bottom. And each of these little plateaus you see here is a 90-degree roll in the gyroscope. So the tag is showing us every time the whale rolls 90 degrees on its side. And it turns out with the video image and superimposing it with this data, each of these is the whale creating a feeding pit. It rolls 90 degrees on its side, goes down to the bottom, engages in the suction for a period of 10, 15 seconds, 20 seconds, sometimes longer. And that's what represents. So our video only lasts for a few hours, but the video ended up giving us the way to interpret the sensors of the tag. And now the tag can record for days and we can interpret it. And just to see what that involves, here's a whale diving to the bottom. It just surfaced, and now it's here. You see the bottom right here. It's instantly at the bottom because this is only 7, 8 feet deep. Here's a little plume of mud. Each of these little dimples you see is a feeding hole for a ghost shrimp. And now this whale is, you can see, more or less motionless with its right side down on the bottom. And then at some point here, you're going to start to see plumes of mud streaming by. And this is the whale, we think, using its tongue and throat to suck in and out and filter this slurry of mud and ghost shrimp and water and pull out these ghost shrimp. And thanks to some of the research being done by researchers at DNR, and then in the 1990s, a graduate student at the University of Washington called Lori Whitecamp, she measured some of the prey densities of ghost shrimp inside and outside of those pits that I showed you, and showed they were effectively removing the ghost shrimp from inside those pits. And now with our tag data, we could actually look at how often the whale was feeding and put that together. Oh, I don't want to run that again. And just to look at a couple of pictures of data from that. Here you see the tidal cycle. This is high tide going to low tide, going to high tide, over about, this is I think a 38-hour period. And what you'll see is in blue here, this is where the whale was feeding in those shallow areas. And you can see that they fed not just right at high tide, but really skewed to right before high tide, and they knew to get out of there as the tide started to fall. And it only lasted, they really could only access these areas for a few hours at a time. And all the other data told us the rest of the time, they were just resting and waiting around and largely not feeding. So why would they engage in this high-risk strategy, accessing prey only for a few hours? And all the whales did this. And it turned out when we did some calculations, this is taking some of the data from Lori Whitecamp's original work, showing prey densities both inside and outside these feeding pits, and showing that the whales had effectively removed a large amount of prey, but also showing the biomass of prey density that existed and comparing it to the main feeding areas for gray whales in Alaska. And the bottom line message here is these prey densities were way higher, and the whales were removing or decreasing the amount of prey in those feeding pits this difference from here to here is way bigger than even if they were removing 100% of the prey in their main areas. So even though they could access it for only a few hours, that return was worth that risk that they were taking. Okay, now sometimes whales get in trouble with that risk. This is a whale from August of 2017 that was actually feeding on the outer coast of Washington in really shallow water and actually ended up getting pushed up, getting into that surf zone and was beached. It was actually beached for several days in an area north of Claylock that was not accessible. I was actually in California when this happened and heard about it. There were kind of meetings occurring to strategize. It looked like it was going to be very difficult to do anything for this whale because it was with the surf and the long, shallow area, it would be impossible to get a boat in there. It was not in an area where any heavy equipment could operate. It was part of the Olympic National Park. And in the end, I flew back and we ended up coming up with, I think, a pretty successful strategy where we buried an anchor offshore and then ran a rope through a pulley to it. We're able to use a harness on the whale, dig out around the whale, and working with the Park Service, with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, SR3, another response group, and Cascadia. We actually had, some of you might know, the Olympia area rowing has a junior program. We actually had 4 very skilled rowers that we recruited and came out. My daughter was one of them, and they came out, and we ended up with a volunteer crew that was able to pull on this rope through this pulley and help to maneuver this whale out at high tide. Obviously, you can't pull a whale, but as the tide came in, what it allowed us to do is turn the whale, and then as waves came in, we could use the rope and pulley for every gain the whale could make. We could at least hold it in that position so it wouldn't lose ground with the next wave. And it was extra challenging because the high tide wasn't until after dark, after 10 o'clock at night. We were pretty convinced this would not be successful, but we wanted to give it a try. And initially when the whale first started to come out, and this was in the dark with very few lights, it looked like the whale started to turn around and come back ashore. And then somehow I think it got its bearings, and it was really kind of misty and foggy, and then slowly it just disappeared off through the waves. And we were all kind of left on the beach at like 11 at night, not really believing this had worked out. And we actually patrolled the beach for several days afterward, and it didn't restrand. We're still waiting to re-sight this whale. But it looks like it was a whale that was healthy enough. It just accidentally got beached. There's some whales that when they beach themselves, they're in such poor health. You can't really save them, but this looks like one that we could save. Okay, now, gosh, see, I'm going way too long. I'm just going to show you a little clip of humpback whales, and then I'm going to cover those threats pieces, and I'm going to go quickly, so don't lose too much patience with me. This is just to show you now, we've talked about gray whales, but I wanted to show you some of the insights these tags are giving us with humpback whales now, bringing us back to humpback whales. And this was one of our more dramatic deployments on a group of humpback whales in Monterey Bay 2 years ago. And I'm going to start out by showing you 2 images of us deploying the tag. This lower image is from a GoPro that I'm wearing as the driver on the boat. And then this top image is from the tagger who's in front, who's James Fallbush. And the 2 of us were approaching a group of about a dozen humpback whales that were feeding on a school of anchovies in Monterey Bay. And there were lots of sea lions and birds around. And this was one of the more scary deployments we did because, usually we're trying to approach more single whales, but to try to approach and get in the middle of these dozen whales that are actively engaged in feeding. So you'll see we kind of do it rather slowly at first, gingerly approaching from behind till we can plop this tag on. And let me see if I can I don't know if we have any. There is some sound associated with this, but it's not worth trying to do it. But here you can see all of those whales. You see the birds feeding, and we're sort of just trying to creep up behind them here And we're zeroing in. There's actually a whale right here that we're kind of watching from above and trying to keep an eye on that we're going to try to get. It's one of the trailing edges, trailing whales in the group. And then we're waiting for it to surface here. And James now sees it surfacing. There it is right there. And now he's able to put the tag right squarely in the middle of the back. And now we're going to transition to the images from the tag, which is going to consist of a rear-facing image here on the right side and a forward-facing image here on the left side. And I don't know, can we dim the lights by chance? Maybe not. Maybe you can see okay. But you'll see the sea lions behind this whale. They're trailing the whale, picking up, and you'll see some of the birds doing this, picking up some of the anchovies. You'll see other whales behind, and then coming into view right after, see, those are some of the sea lions. This is a school of anchovies right here on the top left that the whale is then going into. And the whale, opens its lower jaw that you can't see and engulfs that. And then it almost right away almost collides with this other whale right here. And you'll see it actually does this huge grunt and exhales because it catches by surprise. And now you see the seabirds picking off some of the anchovies that kind of got away from the whale, if you will. And there you'll see us in our boat on the right side there as we're following after this. And these whales, it was interesting. Humpback whales are kind of well known for their cooperative feeding. But in this case here, we actually thought we were seeing more competitive feeding because these whales hadn't quite figured out how to cooperate. So mostly they were getting in each other's way. And we frequently saw these where the whales had to, avert their attempt at a lunge because another whale was in its way. And we witnessed several of these collisions between whales. So these Monterey whales have a little bit to figure out. There you see a dead fish going by there. And this is just the first unedited 2 minutes off of this tag that lasted 4 hours. But we were pretty thrilled with that, and I'm actually going to cut it short here. I do want to point out that, along with humpback whales increasingly being seen in the Salish Sea, we've also seen the return of some other species. Harbour porpoise, if you're out on the water, is another species we've more commonly seen in Puget Sound. They used to occur on the outer coast and in the straits. They're highly vulnerable to entanglement and gill nets, but they've returned into Puget Sound where they used to be common in the 1940s and 50s. We've also had, and some of the surveys that the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the seabird surveys they did, have actually shown the transition going back to the early 1990s up through recent years of this increasing spread of Harbour porpoise into Puget Sound that's occurred. We've also had a number of other species show up that unfortunately I'm not going to be able to go into more. I'm going to show you just a few slides about threats to whales and then kind of halt it because I want to mention that there are quite a few threats to whales. The first three that I've mentioned there are three that are going on right now. That we're able to document some of the mortalities and injuries that occur related to these. And the fourth one is sort of this key long-term one that probably is the biggest one of concern over time. Entanglements, I just want to point out, these are entanglements by year off of along the U.S. West Coast, and you'll see this huge spike that's occurred in the last 3 years in number of entanglements. And most of these were in California, and a smaller proportion were off Washington. But if I go to this slide, this is now taking only Oregon and Washington data, and these are numbers of entanglements of whales documented, which underrepresents the true number because these are only the ones we're able to document. And you'll see this huge spike that occurred in the last year of entanglements off Washington. And this is a combination of a few things that are occurring. Some of it is the increasing number of whales. But as there are more whales, they also expand their territories and areas they feed, bringing them, in some of these cases, into increased overlap with some of these fishing activities. So it isn't just there's twice as many whales, so there'll be twice as many entanglements. It's more as the whale population increases, it expands into areas where many more whales are exposed to a much higher level of threat than just the fact there are more whales, because their habitat and their area of use has expanded. So this is one major threat. We do, there are numerous efforts underway in each state. The Dungeness crab fishery, the commercial Dungeness crab fishery, is one of the predominant fisheries that is involved in these entanglements. And in all 3 states, there are working groups of fishermen trying to strategize over ways to modify gear and use best practices to reduce this. They've all recognized that this is now a major threat, and they don't want their fishery to be tainted like the tuna fishery was with the dolphin bycatch decades ago. So they're trying to be more proactive. But you can see how this issue has exploded, and it's probably going to take some more dramatic measures, whether it's closures during the peak periods that humpback whales are there, because most of the Dungeness crab fishery is in the winter and spring. And you could eliminate some of the time periods that mainly overlaps with the whales, or look at sensitive areas. Another measure we can take is we do actively engage in disentangling whales. But this is tough to do, and it's another risky behavior that we engage in to try to free whales that are entangled. These are just some pictures from some of the ones that we engage in. This is one from northern Puget Sound last year with a gray whale, and here we are approaching a gray whale trying to grapple a line and buoy that you can see trailing behind it. And then by hooking that, you then use this small boat and get towed by the whale. And then you can use that period where you're getting towed behind the whale to try to cut it free, because you don't want to just cut away the trailing line. So here's underwater images taken to try to figure out where was it entangled, so we know where to try to cut free that whale. And what you need to do is try to eliminate the wraps that are around the body of the whale, or sometimes through the mouth of the whale, because that's what will end up killing the whale, not just the fact it's trailing this gear behind. We actually try to discourage fishermen from just cutting away the trailing gear, because that often makes it harder for us to then engage in this and actually cut away the parts that kill the whale. We go through this documentation, and that big spike you saw of entanglements, we try to document and, where possible, engaged in these efforts. But sometimes it's pretty tragic and dramatic how entangled these whales are, sometimes pinned to the bottom as they get entangled in more and more of these crab pots that they'll pick up. And many of the stranded whales we get show signs of entanglement. This is the proportion of our strandings that showed signs of entanglement by decade. And you'll see it's been something steadily increasing, even as a proportion of the whales that we examine. Another threat we face is ship strikes. This is particularly true for blue whales and fin whales, and to a lesser degree humpback and gray whales. But many of the areas I study blue whales, these are photos I've taken in the course of our research, blue whales directly in the path of ships, where major ship transit routes, either into San Francisco or into LA Long Beach, the busiest port we have on the West Coast, intersect some of these main feeding areas for whales. And so we've been working on measures to reduce that. This is a humpback whale we tagged in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, documenting its movements through the straits and the shipping lanes in our area. And we've also worked on some papers. This is out of a paper we published last year, showing some of the higher risk areas in red for some of these ship strike risks, that include areas up here off Washington through the straits, as well as these areas around San Francisco and LA Long Beach. So anyway, I know that was really quick on kind of ship strikes, and I hardly got to ship noise and talking about underwater sonar, something else we've been studying, the impact of whales. I did want to have at least one slide acknowledge the important work that's going on southern resident killer whales, and the fact that the governor's had this task force that has now released recommendations, with some very costly and extensive actions, though many of the whale conservation people feel like they still don't go far enough, primarily thinking about ways to target some of the main factor that seems to be affecting the survival of southern resident killer whales, which really boils down to the fact they're specialized feeders on Chinook salmon. And a lot depends on the abundance of Chinook salmon and having enough for them to feed on. Okay, I think that's probably, I have a few conclusions up there.